chess friends, I hope you are doing well. Today, I am going to show you an incredible chess game I played against Berserk. I will also review a recent game played by Magnus Carlsen in the titled cup. The first game features Magnus Carlsen against Luban of Sergei. This game is particularly fascinating because Sergei sacrificed his bishop, leading to a remarkable match. I hope you enjoy this content, so let's get started without wasting any time. Sergei started the game with d4. And Magnus responded with knight f6. Sergei continued with c4. Magnus could have played e6 followed by d5, but instead, he chose d6. This move suggests that knight d7 will be a critical move, leading to e5 as a central theme, along with g6 followed by bishop g7. This position is known as the pirate defense, where black might also play knight c6. After knight c3, Magnus played e5, aiming to open up the center. Magnus seems to be trying to draw this game by exchanging queens, as it's round 5, and he is playing with the black pieces, which often reduces winning chances from the opening. However, I didn't expect this from Magnus Carlsen, the #1 chess player in the world, but Sergei, aiming for a win, continued with knight f3. Magnus played knight d7, signaling his intention to push g6 because the bishop's diagonal is blocked by the pawn chain from c7 to e5. The knight on d7 supports the e5 pawn, activating the light square bishop later in the game. Magnus is preparing for a short castle by moving his bishop to g7, a typical King's Indian defense structure. After e4, g6 and h3, white prevented any knight entry on g4, allowing the bishop to move to e3, followed by queen d2. Forming a queen-bishop battery to launch an attack along the diagonal, the black bishop might be eliminated, creating weaknesses on the dark squares of black's kingside. This setup opens the possibility of playing g4 and g5. With the pawn on c4, the bishop cannot move to c4 to create an invasion on the f7 square. After bishop g7, bishop takes e3 and recapture. We have castles and queen d2. Sergei played queen d2 to position his bishop on h6 to eliminate black's bishop, allowing a pawn push to g4 and g5. Known as the g4 opening strategy, at this juncture, the dark square bishop controls many squares, and the pawn on c4 facilitates a potential pawn push by black to b5, opening the rook file. After rook e8, controlling the half-open e file, white played f3 to solidify his structure and threaten a pawn push to g4 followed by g5. Magnus responded with c6, aiming to prevent knight invasions on d5 and b5, and preparing a pawn push to d5 to open the d file. White is likely to castle long because the c4 pawn blocks the light square bishop, making it difficult for white to activate it. Short castling is less viable due to dark square weaknesses, and moves like knight h5 and knight g3 could become significant threats for white. Therefore, knight to e5 can also invade and create some counterplay in the central squares. To respond, Sergei first played long castle. After d5, this move creates striking pressure on the center and aims to open up the d file. When captures occurred on the d5 square, it might be tempting to capture the pawn on d5, but this would be a mistake. Black can respond with knight to b6, dominating the d5 square with 3 pieces. This opens the dark square diagonal and the file, freeing the light square bishop's diagonal. The pawn structure on the kingside would be under pressure, especially since the pawn is on f3, not f2. Sergei then played bishop to h6, attacking the dark square bishop. After the captures, Magnus should have captured the dark square bishop on h6 to secure his kingside and reduce white's attacking pieces. However, Magnus played queen to c7, a questionable move aimed at attacking the bishop. Sergei then captured the pawn on f7, sacrificing his bishop to expose black's king. The best move in this position might not be to capture the pawn on f7 immediately or to retreat the bishop to b3. Instead, a more cunning move would be knight to f5, attacking the bishop on g7 and protecting the bishop on h6. If black captures the knight, white can respond with queen to g5, attacking the bishop on g7. If black's knight moves to h5 to protect the bishop, white can sacrifice the bishop on f7, exposing the black king. This would allow white to capture the knight on h5, and after the king retreats, bishop takes g7 followed by queen takes e8 would win material for white. This would leave black's king completely exposed, making the game highly favorable for white. So let me share a beautiful quote with you. Letting go means to come to the realization that some people are a part of your history but not a part of your destiny. In the actual game, Sergei didn't find the best move knight to f5, and Magnus likely didn't anticipate it either. Instead, Sergei played the second best move, bishop takes f7, to expose the king. Consequently, Sergei played knight b6 to attack on the queen. The best move for black at this point was to play bishop takes h6 to gain a tempo on the queen and king. However, Magnus made an inaccurate move with queen to c6, trying to protect his queen. White then played an amazing move, knight to d6 check, forking the pieces. As the king retreated to g8, white captured the rook on e8. To be honest, the best move here was to play bishop takes g7, followed by capturing the rook on e8 with a check. However, Sergei first captured the rook on e8, initiating a heavy attack. After the captures on g7, black had the option to play knight takes g7 to protect the king and maintain flexibility. After rook e1, the knight could move back to f8, opening the diagonal for the bishop and allowing the rook to join the game, securing the position for black. In the actual game, instead of capturing the bishop with the knight, black captured it with the king. This was a blunder. Magnus played this blunder, which was quite surprising given his level of skill. Magnus, despite being a top player, can fall into chess traps and tactics set by opponents, as he's not infallible. After rook to e1 to gain access to the e-file, and with the king exposed on g7, it becomes a target for the queen and rook. Following knight f6, rook e7 check, and the king's retreat, rook to e1 applies pressure along the e-file. Bishop e7 and g4 were played to prepare g5, aiming to displace the knight and pressure the knight and bishop simultaneously. After queen to d6, Magnus attempted an exchange, but after rook takes e8, he resigned as the position was lost. If the knight captures on e8 to protect the queen on d6, rook captures the knight, forcing the capture back, and then queen takes d6 wins the queen for white, leaving white with an extra knight and queen. This game showcases strategic play and decisive tactics. Moving on to another game from chess.com, where I played against Berserk, a strong chess player known for its cool style. The game unfolded with authentic and reliable play, which we'll delve into now. I started the game with e4, and black responded with pawn to e6. At this point, I could have played pawn to d4 or knight to c3, but I opted for pawn to b3 followed by bishop to b2, sacrificing the pawn on e4. However, capturing the pawn on e4 is not advisable because I can respond with knight to c3. Then, you might be tempted to play pawn to f5 to protect your structure, but I can counter with pawn to f3 or d3 to break your structure and open up diagonals and spaces for my pieces. Returning to the position, Berserk played knight to f6, attacking the pawn. After e5 and the knight's retreat, I played pawn to d4, gaining a big center advantage while your center remains passive and closed, with pieces demobilized. This contrasts with the scenario I showed you in the previous video, where black's pieces got stuck behind their own small center structure. Therefore, I responded with pawn to c4 after playing knight to d2 to open up space and create attacks on the c4 square with my pieces. Eventually, the rook can come to c1 to gain access to this file, and I can push my pawn to a4 to solidify my center and structure. Black had the option to consider pawn to c5 to attack the center with support from the bishop and knight, which was actually played in the game. After c3 and pawn exchanges in the d4 square, black immediately played pawn to b6. I think black should have gone with pawn to f6 to attack the center with the pawn and knight, but instead chose pawn to b6 to play bishop a6 and eliminate the light square bishop. After f4 to solidify the center, bishop a6 and bishop exchanges occurred. Later, knight c3 and knight b8 happened in the game, with black maneuvering the knight to c6 followed by knight to b4, and potentially bishop b4 to pin the knight. As the game progressed and my queen reached p3, the b-pawn being pushed forward meant it couldn't move back, and consequently, the queen couldn't move to b6 to create counterplay. Alright. Black had the option to consider rook c8 to access the c-file, but because the pawn is pushed forward one step, it creates weaknesses on these light squares for the knights. This is why the knight moves back to c7 to protect the light squares from the queen's entry. After the castling, queen to d7, and rook to c1 happened in the game to gain access to the c-file. Knight to b5 followed, causing problems in the center. Some might consider bishop e7 and long castle. But that's a rubbish move, as I can consider knight to g5, attacking with my queen and knight on the king side. I can also double up my rooks on the c-file to pressure these knights. Instead, Berserk shows long castle, which seems unnatural and bad as the rook has an open file on the king's diagonal. The knight can come to b5, the queen has an open diagonal, and pawns can advance to a3 and b4. After a few moves, we have rook to a8, then bishop to d2 followed by queen to b3 and rook to c8. The knight moves back, but you can see Berserk is protecting his kingside with many pieces. He's using rifles, bombs and aircraft, securing the king with the rooks and 90% of his pieces. After the knight moves back to d3 followed by knight to c5, white has two connected passed pawns on a and b5, and black maneuvers knights to d8 and e8 while attacking the rook on c1. I declined the rook exchange offer with my knight. As the rook moves to c4, we have knight to b2 and pawn to b5 to open up the queen side. Then, Berserk played pawn to a5 to lock down the position, but this gave me an opportunity to play knight to a4, attacking the b6 pawn and creating counterplay. After some moves and repetitions, as the bishop moves back to e8, the pawn on d4 becomes unguarded. However, capturing it isn't possible, as I can capture the b6 pawn, forking the queen and rook. After you capture it with your king, I can play bishop to f2, pinning down the rook. Returning to the position, rook takes d4 is not possible, leading to rook to c8. After the knight and rook moves, we have rook to d1, king slides, and rook to b1 to access the half-open file. The knight also pressures the b6 pawn. Once the pawns are eliminated, the king will be exposed. Black's knights from d8 and e8 are frozen and unable to move freely, so after a couple of moves later, my knight reaches the e4 square, and you can't capture it with your pawn because your rook on c4 would be hanging. Additionally, my knight is attacking the pawn on b6, and the bishop from a hidden diagonal is sniping at b6 after removing the pawn on d4. As the king moves back, I play the cunning move knight to c5. Have you ever seen such a move in your whole life? It attacks the knight, which is also targeted by many pieces. However, none of your pieces except the best one can capture the knight. If you dare to do so with your bishop capturing my knight on c5, I can easily recapture with my pawn, threatening to capture your rook because my rook from d1 controls the d-file. You would lose your queen, and I would have a winning position. Also, I am threatening to capture the pawn on b6, creating counterplay against your king and queen. The position would be completely lost for you. So let me inspire you by sharing a divine quote. The person who is not disturbed by happiness and distress and is steady in both is certainly eligible for liberation. Returning to the position, we see that capturing the knight with the bishop is not possible. If you dare to move your queen to protect it, then I can consider knight back to b2, attacking your rook and trapping it. Berserk decided to capture the knight with his pawn because he had no other choice. After the recapture, my knight is threatening to come to b6, and the dark square bishop is energizing the structure. Even my rook on b1 solidifies the connected passed pawns, and the rook on c1 can come to further solidify the structure. This position is completely favorable for me, prompting consideration of queen takes c4, with your pawn pinned. If you dare to capture my queen, then I can recapture yours. After the queen moves and rook to c1 and rook f4 happen on the board. You can see that two rooks on b and c1 are protecting the pawns well, along with the bishop's diagonal on f2. It's completely winnable for me, and your king's position is exposed as mentioned earlier. If the pawns get eliminated, the king will face a tsunami and wind twister in his squares because the knights are also passive and unable to move. After knight to b6 check forcing the king to move, some might consider king to a7, but it's also a rubbish move as I can capture the pawn on d5. And after your recapture, b6 will fork your queen and king. This position is completely winnable for me. Bergson decided to capture the knight on b6, and after my queen reached e3, I didn't want to capture your rook on b6 because then my pawns would be doubled up on the b file. Instead, I wanted your rook on a4 because two connected rooks support the connected passed pawns. After rook a4, I capture the rook, and after some moves, we have bishop takes a3, queen f3, rook to c1, queen to h4, queen e7, queen takes h6, queen h4, queen e7, queen g5, h4, king to h2, rook a2, rook c7. At this juncture, you can't capture my rook on c7 because then your knight would be under attack, and I would threaten to promote my pawn into a new queen with my rook's support. Instead of capturing the rook on c7, black moved back the king, leading to some repetition checks. Now we have bishop to e3, attacking the queen on h6, and regardless of your queen's move, it's a completely destroy your position, leading to losing the game because I can easily capture your knight on d4. So after the rook moves to d2, attacking the queen on d4, it's a risky move but a great one strategically. The rook is also under attack by the bishop, but I cannot capture it because queen takes d2 would follow, and black is trying to attack my queen on d4. If you dare to capture your queen, black will capture mine. After some rook checks, you still cannot capture my rook on c7 because then I can capture your knight on c7 or promote to a new queen, making the game winnable for me. In this position, we see that rook takes c7 is not possible. After king to b8, I easily grab your bishop on b4, sacrificing the queen since your queen is also under attack. Some might be tempted to capture the bishop on e3, but it's a vulnerable move because the queen is in b4, potentially creating attacks on the king. After rook c8 check and the king moves to e7, delivering a check and attacking the knight, the position becomes favorable for me. After capturing your queen, regardless of your rook's move, it's a weak position for black. Any rook move would lose your two knights. Berserk played rook to d1, sacrificing his rook to capture the rook on c7 and the passed pawn. I ended up with two pieces and a passed pawn, making it a winnable position for me. After a few more moves, I captured his knight, promoted to a new queen, and checkmated him on g4. What a beautiful game. I hope you enjoyed my content. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Best wishes, bye bye, see you.